It was a beautiful summer day on Sodor, and Gordon had special reason to feel prouder than usual. The Doncaster Admiration Society had come to Sodor and were giving him an award for his reputation as a long-serving Doncaster engine. Many important-looking visitors swooned over Gordon's every piston, and some gave speeches. The president of the club even spoke for 40 minutes extolling Gordon's speed and power. Henry and James watched with jealousy as Gordon's boiler nearly burst with pride. However, the excitement of this visit was soon forgotten when the 80th anniversary of the opening of the main line was celebrated the following week. Even some of the retired engines who used to work on the main line were brought out for the celebration. Much to Henry and James's delight, several speeches were given in honor of them, as well as Gordon. Even Edward received a special mention. "That is very kind of them to remember me," smiled Edward. "I'm just happy to be here today." After the ceremony, some of the visiting engines stayed and spoke with the others before going home to their own railways. Gordon, Henry, and James were especially impressed by Cynthia, an engine who now worked on the mainland and even had her own weekly talk show. In their eyes, she was fully worthy of celebrity status.
"So, tell me, Cynthia,"
Gordon said conversationally.
"how did you go from working on our little line to getting your own talk show? After all, I too have known a taste of fame. I'm sure your story is just as fascinating."
"If memory serves, you didn't work on our line for that long either,"
added Henry. Cynthia smiled. "Well, my dear engines, my story isn't that different from yours. I ran the express on this line for some years, and later went to work on the mainland, where a TV producer discovered my, well, natural talent for public speaking. And the rest? Well, the rest you can see every week at 9 now, can't you?"
"Ha ha! I say she's quite right."
Gordon chuckled.
"Cynthia, I'd like to hear your opinion on goods trains. I'll bet it's the same as ours. And don't even get me started on branch-line goods trains."
The three Sudrian engines groaned in unison. "Actually, you know, I've never had much experience with branch lines. I strictly kept to the main line back in those days, and even today. I dare say I probably wouldn't know what a branch line looked like if it tapped me on the buffers."
"Well,"
Gordon cried.
"that's just what I've been telling the others all these years. Branch lines are vulgar, and us respectable engines shouldn't have a thing to do with them."
"Hear, hear,"
said Henry. But well, you see, I didn't mean." But before poor Cynthia could say anything, her driver came to take her back to the mainland. Farewells were said, but the damage had been done. Now, I may just be an old engine speaking from experience, but you three aren't going to let what she said go to your smoke boxes, are you?
"Oh, my dear Edward, you're a quaint old engine. What could you possibly know of celebrities?"
Gloated Gordon.
"Yeah, the only channel that Edward watches is the Christian channel."
Edward sighed. "I rest my case." The next morning, Gordon and James rolled past Thomas's shed on their way to Knapford Station.
"Don't get too close to the branch line engine shed,"
chortled James.
"Yeah, it's loaded with boiler sludge,"
laughed Gordon. Percy and Thomas were used to the tender engine's teasing, so they took no notice. "Stuff and nonsense," they grumbled. "That ceremony must have gone to their smoke boxes." Emily, however, was a different story. "Why, never, she huffed. She did not appreciate being mocked for being a branchline engine. After all, she used to pull the express on the main line of her former railway. Later that day, she complained to Sir Topham Hatt. I have been working on the branch line for 5 years now. It's only fair that I should be given a chance to pull the express.
I understand your, feelings on this matter,
Sir Topham Hatt said.
But what of Thomas and Percy? They have been on the branch line for nearly 40 years. I would have to let them pull the express as well, to be fair.
Thomas is slow and Percy's boiler's in the clouds, said Emily. I am a strong engine, and I even have my own tender.
Well, I always say my engines deserve a fair trial. Henry needs a tune-up at the yards, so perhaps I can have you pull the 2:15 express to Knapford tomorrow. In the meantime, Molly can take your coaches.
Sounds fine. Wait, sir. That train is off-peak and nearly empty, Emily squeaked. I want to pull the peak time express like Henry, Gordon, and James.
The Peak Express is a very important train. If you do well pulling the off-peak express, then we can have a look at you pulling it in peak hours.
Emily's boiler nearly burst with pride. The next morning, Emily was waiting in the sheds when Thomas returned from pulling the mail train. He was exhausted and looking forward to his nice warm shed. Good morning, Emily, he said, trying his best to put on his cheery smile. Do you realize that I may be able to stay in the sheds at Tidmouth once I start pulling the express? Beamed Emily. Thomas was confused, but he didn't answer. He had fallen asleep before he had even touched the buffers. I never. Typical shunting engines, sniffed Emily. They never think of anyone but themselves. It soon came time for Emily to pull the off-peak express. Edward shunted into the station with Emily's coaches. Hello, he said. I didn't know you would be pulling the express today. On my other railway, I would pull the express all the time. It's nothing new to me. Oh, right then. Good luck, said Edward. Remember not to bounce the coaches too much. It's a long train and the passengers can easily get jostled on curves if you're not careful. They don't like that. Thank you, Edward, Emily huffed. But I know how to pull coaches. The guard blew his whistle and Emily set off, haughtily. I'll show them, she said. I'll show them. Emily soon found the coaches were much heavier than she had expected. She pushed forward with determination, but her driver grew concerned when he looked at the regulator. You're straining, old girl. Go steady, he said. Emily didn't care. She was on pace to reach Cronk Station early, and she was determined to do just that. By the time the train reached Cronk, the passengers had grown quite cross from being jostled around like sardines in a tin can. But Emily didn't notice. Ooh, 1 minute early, she gloated as she looked at the clock. Sir Topham Hatt will be very impressed. Just then, Gordon puffed in for his train to the mainland.
1 minute earlier than Edward. We'll be on time today after all.
The guard blew his whistle and Gordon puffed off.
Poop, poop. Goodbye, Emily.
Emily glowed with pride. But she didn't realize her passengers had been too eager to catch Gordon's train to complain about the bumpy ride. That night, Emily stayed at Tidmouth Sheds. Driver said she would take the 7:30 Peak Express tomorrow since she had done so well.
Always remember, Emily, Branchlines are vulgar, and it takes a vulgar engine to work on one. Take Donald and Douglas, for example. They're Scottish, and we know how vulgar they can be.
But am Scottish, said Emily.
Just remember, dear Emily,
Gordon continued.
any engine can pull the express, but without finesse, it simply can't be done.
The next morning, Emily set off for the 7:30 train from Knapford. It was a hot day, and the passengers at the station were restless and irritable. But they weren't the only ones. Henry was waiting impatiently on the other platform. Finally, Edward arrived with the coaches. "Take care, Emily," said Edward cheerfully. "Remember to pull out carefully and let the coaches ease into motion." But Emily didn't say anything to kind Edward. She was too preoccupied with thinking of how she was going to get to the station early again. She wanted Gordon to see just how much finesse she really had. As soon as the guard blew his whistle, she set off with a jolt. The coaches groaned as Emily pushed out of the station with all her might. Little did Emily know that Lady Hat was also on board this train. "Oh!" she cried out. "Not so fast! Not so fast!" groaned the coaches. "We want Gordon." "Shut up!" snapped Emily. Emily was so cross that she didn't pay attention to her driver. "Hey, it's all for the signals!" he yelled as he applied the brakes. But Emily didn't listen. Instead of watching for the signal, she plowed ahead even faster. Before the signalman could change the switches, Emily found herself on the branch line. "Now you've done it," cried her driver. Little did Emily know that Benjamin the ballast engine was up ahead performing maintenance on the rails. He liked being out on the branch line. It was a hot summer day, but this part of the branch line ran through a cool, shady grove. Suddenly, Benjamin heard a whistle approaching. To his horror, he looked up and saw Emily thundering towards him with the express.
Oh, glory!
Shouted his driver, reaching for the throttle lever.
Not again!
Benjamin cried as he shuttled backwards as fast as he could. When Emily saw Benjamin up ahead, she applied her brakes with all her might. The force of her applying the brakes sent a rude jolt throughout her coaches, sending some poor passengers flying to the ground. Even though Emily was braking as hard as she could, she was still bearing down on Benjamin much too fast. Luckily, an alert signalman saw what was happening. He dropped his coffee and diverted poor Benjamin into a siding. Just in time. Gradually, Emily came to a stop. Her brakes were aching since they had never been pushed that hard. However, the passengers were fuming. They piled out of the coaches and started yelling at Emily and her driver. "Young man, I have never had such an uncomfortable train ride," exclaimed Lady Hat. "Oh, my husband shall hear of this." And he did. Extensively.
Children may like playing hot potato, but my passengers do not,
Sir Topham Hatt said sternly.
You bounced my passengers and my wife around like a hot potato. There is much more to pulling the express than racing about like a speed demon. If you are serious about being an express engine, I recommend you let Edward teach you how.
But yes, sir, Emily sighed. Sir Topham Hatt paused.
Is there something else you'd like to say, Emily?
It's not fair. I wanted to prove that I knew how to pull the express too. I do. I used to pull it on my railway. I wanted a chance because I deserved a chance, and now I blew it. It's just not fair. Sir Topham Hatt reflected.
You know, Emily, we all get a little, rusty when we haven't done something in a while. With practice, and with a little more patience, I think you would be a fine express engine. But I can't let you pull it again until, and if, I see both those things in you. Do you understand?
Yes, sir, said Emily. I wanted to prove myself. To Gordon, to show him I had finesse.
Gordon, Sir Topham Hatt said. I should have known he was tangled up in this somehow. Sometimes I could swear that the Express is almost more trouble than it's worth. He muttered under his breath, and he walked away, deep in thought. Later that night, Thomas pulled into the shed after a long day.
Hey, Thomas. I'm sorry for being rude to you, said Emily. Oh, don't mention it, said Thomas. We all feel down once in a while. I've been so foolish, complained Emily. I was rude to Edward when he was just trying to help, and I was so puffed up in the boiler that I... Before she could finish, Emily heard a loud snoring. Thomas had once again fallen asleep before he even touched the buffers. Well, I guess some things never change. Speaking of which, Gordon, Henry, and James came idling by on their way back to Tidna's sheds.
What's that over there?
Gloated James.
It's a Branchlines shed.
Sniffed Henry.
You can tell by the small doors and dirty sidings.
Definitely not fit for a Doncaster.
Grinned Gordon.
Say, hang on a moment. Isn't that Emily, who used to pull the Express? She did until she played hot potato with the passengers,
said James. Before Emily could say anything, the engines laughed and puffed away. Huh, snorted Emily. I may be rude, but I would never be that rude. The nerve! I have had just about enough of those three.
Seems like you're not appreciated around here,
said an oily voice next to the shed.
I know how that feels.
You are quite right, huffed Emily. Finally, someone who understands me.
You deserve a chance to prove them wrong, so show them what you're made of,
said the voice. Yes, but how? Asked Emily. But there was no answer. All she heard was the sound of a diesel horn as the engine pulled away, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. I'll show them, she muttered. I'll show them.